Hello, my name is Richard and today I'm going to be talking about the Affordable Reserves Calculator. This is the math part of a reserve study where you'll input the details of all your commonly owned assets. The workbook can do the calculations using both the component method and the cash flow or pooling method. Today I'm going to be focusing on the component method, and there's a separate video that concentrates on the cash flow or pooling method. The workbook was developed for use with a condo association, but it can also be used by homeowner associations, timeshares, apartment or office blocks, and all types of clubs and societies. The workbook is sold for use at one location only, and sharing the workbook is not permitted. So the first thing to do is to download the workbook from AffResCalc.com, and remember, you'll need to have Excel macros enabled for the workbook to function correctly. And then, let's go ahead and have a look. This is what the workbook looks like when you first open it up. There are 3 tabs for each method of calculation: Summary, Input and Calculations. Let's move to the Component Method Summary tab, and you can see that it has 3 main areas. On the left, Basic Data, which we'll complete in a moment, and on the right, the calculation results and the detailed year-by-year summary. We'll start with inputting some basic data. First, your property or organisation's name. We'll call it Riverside. Then the current year. The assumption is that you'll put the information in for the current year, and the calculation results will give you the funding amount from the beginning of the next year. Next, the number of contributors. We'll use 15. That's how many people are sharing the cost, which can be the number of apartments or homes or offices or members. It depends on your organisation. And then the current financial information. In this case, how much is being contributed to the reserve fund in the current year? Let's say $7,200. This is the annual amount, so if it's paid monthly, it'll be 12 times the number of contributors times the amount paid. In this case, it works out to be $40 a month. The balance at the beginning of the year will be input along with the other asset details. We'll come back and look at the rest of the Summary tab later. For now, let's move to the Input tab. The data needed is pretty much the same for all reserve studies. We'll look at it on the way through. As you can see, I've already input some asset information. You don't have to number the items if you don't want to, but it can be really helpful for cross-referencing to other parts of your reserve study, such as more detailed descriptions, photographs, details of conditions of the assets, or estimates for their replacement cost. Local rules or state legislation may govern what assets need to be included, and you should make sure that you know what the regulations are for your location. If you've already saved for asset replacement, then you probably have a list of assets and potentially the value that you saved towards each of them at the beginning of the year. You'll need to allocate the funds across the assets if that's not already done. If you're starting from scratch, you'll have to decide on the assets whose replacement you'll be funding. And again, if you've previously saved anything, then allocate those funds across the assets. And then the other information that you'll need to input. First up, an estimate of the life of each asset. That's how long it's expected to last from new until the time it would normally need to be replaced. And then how many years are left. That's how many years are remaining now before it needs to be replaced. And note, a 0 here means that it will be replaced in the current year, a 1 for next year, and so on. Next, the replacement cost. This should be at today's values. Don't try to guess the effects of inflation. Costs and contributions will need to go up with inflation going forward, but you should think about those separately. They can't be built into this workbook. Now remember, this is the most important tab. Choose your assets with care, estimate their lives and remaining lives accurately as you can, and be realistic with their replacement cost amounts. If possible, get professional quotes wherever you can. Finally, see the note on the right. It's a reminder that the data has not yet been included in the calculations. To do that, you need to go back to the Summary tab and select the data set that you've used. We've input into the original data set. There are 2 columns for alternative options. They may be used for things like adding smaller assets into your study, see what the effect is, or planning for next year. So let's go back to the Summary tab. So, on the right there are the options for which dataset is included in the calculations. Click the button to update and we'll choose the original column. It takes a moment or two, that's machine dependent, and you can see the results updated in the details by year. Unlike the cash flow method, where you need to determine your contributions, the component method does it for you immediately. The calculation results show you in summary the minimum and maximum fund balances throughout the 25-year calculation period, the minimum and maximum annual and monthly contributions, and the fund balance at the end of the period. These calculations are based on fully funding the future contributions across all the asset base immediately from next year. What this means is, for each asset, equal instalments from now until the time it's replaced, amounting to the difference between the opening value that you input and the replacement cost, divided by the number of years until that replacement is due. Once the asset has been replaced, the amount saved will then be replacement cost divided by the number of years life of each asset. Looking at the details by year, you'll notice that from the third year on, contributions are virtually static, declining very slowly as the assets get replaced. This decline is a function of the amount being saved now compared to the amount that will be saved after the asset has been replaced for the first time. We'll see it in more detail on the Calculations tab, but before we leave this tab, notice the large contributions next year. This is a catch-up of the current underfunding, and we'll look at that further. And also see the large expenditure in 2037, causing the funds balance to drop significantly. Amongst other things, this is when the roof replacement was scheduled based on your input data. So let's have a look at the calculations that have produced these results by moving to the Calcs tab. Here we can see all of the assets and which dataset is in use, in this case the original dataset. It shows each year out for the full 25 years. Each year shows any spend and the balance carried forward for each individual asset. That is to say, for each component making up the total fund. At the bottom is the total expenditure for each year, the total sum of the balances of all the individual assets, the amount contributed, and the running total of the funds. You can see from the percentage totals underneath the annual balance line, at the end of the current year, our savings are only 90% of the fully funded balance, and from next year going forward it's always 100%. So essentially, the large contribution for next year is a cashing up of the shortfall in the opening balance position. If your opening savings are in fact more than 100% financing, then the reverse is true and next year's contributions would be smaller, but I don't think many will be in that situation. So, depending on the severity of this catch-up contribution, it may or may not be an acceptable solution. We'll look at the options to deal with that a little later. For now, back to the top of the sheet, you'll notice that there are percentages underneath the life and cost columns and a column called Exclude. Let's go back to the summary page and explore these options further. Firstly, let's consider the assets that you included on the Input tab. If you've included all the common assets that will require replacement, then you'll have a range of values. Some people like to save for all of these, while others will perhaps save for the larger items and just pay for the smaller ones as and when they arise. You may be subject to local rules or regulations on this subject. We are here in Florida, so make sure you know what the mandatory limit is. Let's assume for a moment that you're subject to regulation that says you must save for all assets that have a replacement cost of $7,500 or more. So let's exclude assets with a lesser value than this. You can put the amount in where it says exclude assets with a replacement cost less than, so that these assets aren't included in the calculations. Or you might not want to exclude them all, in which case put in any smaller value to see what the effect is on your future payments. This has reduced the level of contributions, and you'll see that the variation from next year into future years is significantly less, but it does mean that you'll need to fund those excluded assets as and when they need replacing. Let's look at the effect on the Calcs tab. All of the excluded assets are marked with an X. You can manually adjust these exclusions here, adding or taking away X's, and you can start here if you want without having input any value on the Summary tab, just inputting all your exclusions manually. Do note, however, if you put 0 exclusions on the Summary tab, it will clear all exclusions, including those that you put in manually. So this is a method of fine-tuning your payments by adding and subtracting some of the smaller value assets. Back to the Summary tab. Next, let's think about your life and cost assumptions. When estimating life expectancy, one person will base assumptions on early replacement, others will assume that life can be stretched out until it actually breaks. Similarly, where estimating replacement costs, some people will quite naturally assume that list price is good, while others might fancy their negotiating skills and estimate lower costs. With the increase and decrease percentages, you can flex the calculations to test those assumptions. Let's just put the workbook back to having no exclusions. Replace the 7,500 with 0. So, looking at the asset life first, let's assume you based all of your input on extending all of their lives as long as possible, and you think that perhaps overall they might be 10% optimistic. So instead of 10 years that you input, 9 years might be more realistic. So input minus 10% in the life expectancy. Immediately you'll see that because things have been replaced earlier, contributions have gone up. Previously, the monthly contribution in 2023 and 2024 were $130 and $72. Now you'll see they've gone up to $181 and $88. Reset the workbook back again, and instead look at the replacement costs. Are they all at book value? Perhaps you think you're a great negotiator, so reduce the replacement costs by 5%. And this time, with the replacement costs going down, the contributions come down as well, 114 and 67. So by flexing these options, you can fine-tune your reserve study finances to achieve an affordable contribution, saving for appropriate assets, and test the sensitivity of your assumptions. And finally, on the Summary tab, you'll see the button for increasing and decreasing the number of calculation lines. The workbook is initially set up with 20 lines. You can increase this 5 at a time up to a maximum of 80, and you can decrease them in the same way. Do note, however, if you have any data in the lines that you delete, that data will be lost and cannot be recovered. So, let's now return to the potential issue of the large catch-up payment for year 2. We saw one way of easing this by excluding some of the assets. However, that does mean, of course, that you have to find the funds to pay for those assets when it's time for them to be replaced. Another option would be to levy a one-off payment up front. Put the cost back to 0 and let's look at the Calcs tab again. Comparing the contribution in 2023 of $23,396 with the contribution in 2024 of $13,033, there's a difference of $10,363. That's about $690 for each of the 15 contributors. So, if everybody contributed $690 up front into the reserve fund, you effectively increase the current year contribution from $7,200 to $17,550. Doing this on the Summary tab, you'll see that it flattens out the future payments at $72 a month. And had it been spread across the current year, the contributions would have been $98 a month compared to the actual of $40. This, of course, may not be an acceptable solution either. The final two options that I'm going to show you must be approached with some caution and with due regard to whether they are acceptable under local rules and legislation. So, put the current contributions back to $7,200 and let's go to the Calcs tab again. Firstly, the workbook is set up at 100% funding. If it's allowed, you might consider funding at a lower level and making up any shortfall when replacements are due. If you assume funding at 90%, then you would have to collect the extra 10% later. So, change the funding on the Summary tab from 100% to 90%. And you can see that this reduces the contributions and virtually eliminates the apparent underfunding. However, there are anomalies. Look at 2037 when the roof replacement is scheduled. The 10% not funded needs to be found in that 1 year. That means an additional payment will need to be levied on each contributor. To some this may be acceptable and to others it may not. Lastly, let's consider spreading the current shortfall into future years. Reset the funding level to 100% and go again to the Calcs tab. On the left at the bottom you'll see an Allow Editing box. Click the Allow button and you'll see highlighted the percentage cells that you can change. It allows for flexing out for 10 years, but I would encourage you to rectify any shortfall that you have as quickly as possible. This is very much a trial and error method, and I'll spread the shortfall over 4 years as an example. I'll put in 92%, 94.5%, 97%, and 99%. This gives a fairly smooth transition from underfunding to fully funded, and as I say, it's best to try and achieve this in as short a time as possible. It might be a more acceptable solution, but most importantly, be sure that you're allowed to do it. Well, that concludes our look at the Affordable Reserves Calculator, and just to let you know, as well as the other 3 tabs for the pooling method of funding, there is one other tab outlining the terms and conditions. I hope that you have found the video informative and useful, and that the workbook is just what you were looking for as part of your reserve study. As a final reminder, the Affordable Reserves Calculator can be purchased and downloaded from reservescalc.com. Thank you for watching.